So now that we have our Airtable set up, let's get into integrating it with VoiceFlow. So back in the designer of our VoiceFlow, we're going to add what's called an API step. So if you come to these developer tools on the left and then drag out an API block, you can then connect our last block, which says we will send them to an email to our API step. Think of an API as a tool to get and send information to any services that use APIs. To create records or rows in our Airtable, we're going to use the Airtable API to send it from VoiceFlow to Airtable. So let's head over to Airtable and find the documentation for their APIs. Once you're in the table, come up to the help section and then go down to the API documentation. Now we can come down to table 1 table on the left hand side and then go to create records. On the right side here, you'll see the code that we used for an API request. VoiceFlow has this broken up into fields, so we can just copy and paste them in VoiceFlow. The first thing we want to do is set this get request to a post. Get is getting information and a post is posting, meaning putting information in our table. So you can see post here in the Airtable documentation. What we want to do is copy this URL that's after the post request, bring it back into our VoiceFlow and then paste it here right after where the post is in the API step. Then we have our headers. So we want to go back to the documentation and you can see that we have these two dashed H lines of code. This stands for header. So we want to copy the text here, which says authorization. Go back to VoiceFlow, paste it in here where it says enter parameter key. Go back to the documentation, copy bearer next. Come back to VoiceFlow, paste that in here. And you can see after bearer, there is a space and then our secret API token. This is the personal access token that we set up in the last lesson. So whenever you copied that, you just want to go ahead and add a space after bearer and then paste it here. Next, you can see there is one more header. So what we want to do is press this plus symbol and it'll add another header. From there, we can copy the content type, paste it in the parameter key, and then get the application JSON, which we will paste here. Then we can ignore the parameters field and open up the body and switch this to raw so we can paste exactly what the Airtable documentation tells us. What we want to do is copy everything in these brackets after data, bring it back into VoiceFlow and then paste it here. Then we just want to remove these quotes. Now, what this is doing is getting the records from our table. So this would get anything that we have here, the name, email, and status. So we just want to fill these items in. This is JSON format. So this would just look like adding an enter here. We have our name. So if we go back to the Airtable, you can see the name of this column is name, exactly as I've written it in VoiceFlow. Then we want to add a colon, a space, and then in quotes, we want to enter the variable that we've set for name in VoiceFlow. So whatever the user types, it will fill the name into our Airtable. Then we will add a comma, another enter, and then we'll do our next column, which is email. Again, we'll just write email, colon. From here, in quotes, our email variable, which should be in brackets. Then lastly, our status. So in quotes, status, then our colon. And because we don't want a variable for status, we can just write false. Because of how we are creating records in Airtable, it adds a new record after our most recent. But since we don't have any in our table yet, I just want to go ahead and delete all of these rows so we have an empty table. Right click them and hit delete all selected rows. Then we can come back to VoiceFlow, click the API block, and then hit send request to test it. For a name, I'm just going to write in Pope, and for an email, I'm going to write 123@gmail.com. Then we can hit generate. From here, we will get a 200 status code back, which means it worked. You can see in the bottom left, it says 200 OK. And this is what our request looks like when we get all the data back. We can just go ahead and ignore this. Head back to our Airtable and you can see that the first row we have Pope 123@gmail and the status is false. If we wanted to test this out in Flow, we could run this. And now that it's asking our name, I'll write the Pope. What's your email? 1234@gmail.com. Send this through. Now let's check if this has been added to our table correctly. And you can see it did. We have the Pope and 1234@gmail.com. The reason there's a space is because we added a row after the first entry, but you would normally delete this and then everything would add sequentially.